Okay, I'm going to forego the kind of introduction that Erika Bachiochi deserves for the sake of time, because I'd rather you hear her than hear me talking about her. But I want to add a couple things that are not in the description in your program. Erika did study as an undergraduate at Middlebury College, and then she pursued a JD at Boston University in law. She has written extensively on sexual equality, feminism, dependency. She has 2 books that she edited that you can read about in the program. If you did not read her piece in the collection of readings that came with the program, you should, because it's very, very good and gives you an indication of how thoughtful she really is on this issue. So please welcome Erika Bachiochi for.
I'm coming, really. It occurred to me that I hadn't had coffee, so there's going to be coffee delivered at some point, and then my, cadence will get much quicker. But right now, I'll probably be a little bit sleepy, which will mean nothing for you because I'm usually totally jacked up. So. Okay, so it's really great to be with you. It's really wonderful to share the stage with great professor and the great Ravi George, who's off to get another honor, I think at Oxford, in a little while. They're all piling in, which is perfect. And it's grateful. I'm also grateful for all the work that Love and Fidelity Network has been doing over the years. The yeoman's courage of Cassandra Hugh has always been quite inspiring to me, and then I think the elegant joy of Caitlin is really representative of what everything that Love and Fidelity is trying to do. So it's great to be with you at your annual conference this year. So Caitlin has advertised my talk as I think on one of the tweets, something like that, as a sort of feminist defense of sexual complementarity. So I want to begin by speaking just a bit about how I think about feminism, and then in the context of kind of my life experience, a little bit of my life story. And then I'll spend the bulk of my time on complementarity, or actually how I want to talk about it. I won't use that word again. I don't find it very helpful. I'm going to talk about sexual asymmetry and men and women's shared responsibility for the care of the vulnerable. So the year I graduated from college, a great historian who was to become one of my intellectual heroes, and I'm sure was one of Ravi's good friends, published a book called Feminism is Not the Story of My Life. In the book, the late Elizabeth Fox Genovese documents the way in which the second wave, or what I like to call the abortion wave of the women's movement, beginning in the 1960s and 70s, failed to take account of the lives of ordinary women, those who greatly valued their work as wives and mothers. Genovese laid the groundwork, together with other smart critics of abortion rights feminism, to recover and promote a more authentic feminism, one that takes seriously both the equal dignity of and differences between the sexes. Family feminism, Genovese wanted to call it. So my work in feminist theory follows in that school of thought. But here's sort of the funny thing. Feminism really has been the story of my life. That ill-crafted feminism that Genovese and Marianne Glendon and Jean Beth Elshtain and Christina Hoff Sommers brilliantly critiqued seems perhaps to have won the day during my lifetime, at least in the academy and in elite culture, and politically too, as we await the election, maybe, of the first woman president, herself emblematic of second wave abortion rights feminism. After all, Hillary Clinton has achieved marked educational and professional success in her life, public heights her feminist forebears could have only dreamed of. And yet the scandals surrounding her alleged complicity in her husband's sexual offenses and her extreme support for the abortion industry, whose cultural ascendancy, in my view, has encouraged the same, has made the next likely president of the United States truly the prime symbol of the inherent tensions and contradictions within second wave feminism. Tensions and contradictions that I hope will become more obvious during my remarks here today. And so, for good and for ill, that confused feminism, that Clintonian feminism, has also been the story of my life. As a girl born in the early 1970s who played soccer at the college level, thanks in part, I'm sure, to Title IX, and went on to receive 2 graduate degrees in the late 1990s, second wave feminism paved the way for my athletic and educational achievement. It would be dishonest to deny that. But second wave feminism, that feminism that wedded itself decisively to the sexual revolution, also shaped my personal life. My mother was married and divorced 3 times by the time I reached my 19th birthday. So the feminists of the 1970s tore down age-old obstacles to allow women all the possibilities once available only to men. But so too did it tear down age-old cultural norms that once taught our foremothers and forefathers how to forge and sustain edifying relationships with one another. And so it is this internal tension that wrought both great pain and great possibility in my own life. Indeed, it would take the suicides of 2 close friends, also from broken homes, the first when I was 16 and the next at 18, to chart a change of course in my personal life and to provoke a wellspring of intense intellectual and spiritual questioning, all of which eventually led me, years later, to a deep intellectual and religious conversion, and now decades later, to enjoy a very happy marriage and family life. But first, that questioning would lead me at 16 years old, into 12-step meetings, and once I got to college, right into the doors of the Women's Center on campus, as the contradictions I'll speak of today had not yet become clear to me. After all, apart from the tenets of secular feminism, which I was learning in the women's studies classes in which I enrolled, I'd yet to encounter any compelling, comprehensive worldview that could make sense of my life as I'd experienced it thus far. And the feminists on campus were the only people I'd met who seemed to care more about real-life issues like social justice for the poor and gender inequality than about parties and fraternities. And naturally, the feminists were pro-choice. So early on in college, the pro-choice reflexes I had as a teenager were transformed into pro-choice arguments. This, despite the fact that my support for abortion as a teen amounted to a sort of a escape hatch for a sexual permissiveness I no longer practiced nor believed in once I got to college. And so as I studied and as I prayed to God as I understood God, I began to resist some of what I was learning. Despite the express linkage between the feminist tenets of my classes and the free love philosophy of the sexual revolution, it seemed to me that feminism, at base that quest for women's freedom and equality, was actually better conjoined to my own skeptical views of the then rampant hookup culture that was taking shape around me. Remember, I was on the women's soccer team. There was a lot of drinking and hooking up all around. After all, why would a woman with a strong sense of self-worth, I thought, and a drive to do good in the world, give away her body to a man who didn't truly know her, didn't cherish her mind, didn't take delight in her heart, was just going to use her, even if she thought she was just using him? There was nothing dignified in this, nothing personally edifying. And I recognized what I saw on the faces of my friends the morning after, a chasing after a respect, a valuing that was vacuous. I'd experienced that same chase years before, and it had brought me only emotional grief and distraction from all of my pursuits on the playing fields and in the classroom. I just didn't understand why more women didn't see it the way I did. And 20 years later, I must admit, I am still puzzled by the same, and so grateful for Donna Frita's and others' work. So what I want to do for the rest of my time, now that you've sort of gotten some context about my life, is to think about how we might think about the equality of women and men while rejecting the cult of sexual nihilism that at its core degrades women and men too, and denying the beautiful givens of men and women's sexually distinctive bodies. And I want to do this that I think keeps us mostly out of the current gender mess, because I want to talk about sex, that is about the sexed body, not primarily at least about gender roles and traits and the new concept of gender identity, though I'm happy to talk about all that in the Q&A, though I'd rather leave gender identity to Walt and those guys. I'll then propose a maybe new, or perhaps just really old, way of thinking through sexual equality in sexual difference, as best understood, I think, in service of human dependency. I'm probably trying to do too much, but let's see how far I can get. Bring it on down, the coffee. Oh, you can bring it on down. Great, thank you. Okay, so our culture, did someone take away the water? I'm so needy. I mean, who brought this high maintenance? It's funny, my husband's watching on the live stream, and I'm sure he's thinking, high maintenance. Yeah, thank you. I mean, it couldn't be that high maintenance. I have 6 children. Okay. Perfect transition. Okay. So for the rest of my time, all right, where am I? Okay, so our culture, and I think it's legitimate and deeply confused quest for sexual equality has rejected some really fundamental differences between the sexes. And I think I may disagree with Donna a teeny bit, but at lunch, maybe we saw that we did agree, but we'll see. The sexes are neurologically, hormonally, and biologically distinct. And as such, they experience sexual desire and sex itself distinctively. Ignoring this basic fact of life, often ironically in order to promote women, has harmed women especially badly in my view. So I think it's important straight out of the gate to sort of make explicit, this may be review for some of you, especially who've been hanging out at Love and Fidelity, but really just from the beginning, to make explicit 4 truths about sexuality that are discoverable through human experience and more recently good scientific research. These truths provide the rationale for traditional cultural expectations about sex and really, I think, undergird what was wrong with the sexual revolution, especially for women, but also for men. Well before science made these findings, civilized societies knew these truths and encouraged courtship, not necessarily the 1950s style as Donna was talking about, or maybe, but maybe something different. Women held the lever to sex, and men and women were better for it. So number 1, men have a stronger libido or sex drive than women do. Now, many women I've talked to over the years, especially on college campuses, resist this characterization, arguing, no, women like sex too, but no one said they didn't. They just tend to like it less than men do. And not being in a man's mind, body, person, they have no way of knowing what they are comparing themselves to. As Stephen Rhodes of the University of Virginia put it, sorry, gentlemen, prepare to be embarrassed, the libidos of perfectly ordinary men, when fully understood by women, seem deformed or disreputable to them. Many women strongly resist an accurate presentation of male sexuality. Now, I know there are exceptions to this in every rule. Mark Regnerese calls some women like alpha women but they are rare, and it never behooves a society to shape its social norms around such exceptions. We do much damage this way, as we've seen in the last few decades. Number 2, as such, according to the data, most men would prefer sex early on in a relationship, are quite willing to have sex with a new acquaintance outside of a committed relationship, and desire to have multiple sex partners. Okay, again, this is in the data, just asking all sorts of men base sexual desires. That is, young men tend to experience sexual desire as a need of satisfaction, somewhat like they experience hunger. Now, this doesn't mean that men don't love sex within relationships, that they don't want relationships, or that they aren't capable of putting off sex until they are in a relationship, or gasp, until they are married. The mature ones surely can and do. I'm just talking about base male sexual instincts here, especially as they emerge with massive surges of testosterone early on in adolescence. Number 3, young women, on the other hand, report that they would prefer sex within relationships. And due to the hormone oxytocin's effect on women during sex, they also become more emotionally attached during and after sex. And I should also note at this point that STDs affect women's bodies more profoundly than they do men. In a major study of girls, those who engaged in sex didn't even list sexual arousal as a reason for having sex. One psychologist put the difference like this: male desire aims at the sexual activity itself, whereas female desire aims beyond it toward other outcomes and consequences. And number 4, and I think this is most important, the consequences of sex, even beyond greater emotional connectedness and increased risk of STDs, are far more serious for women than they are for men. Simply put, women get pregnant and men do not. This is sort of an important thing to talk about when you're talking about the hookup culture, I think, just sort of a interesting thing, as Rai was mentioning, that sex can sometimes lead to babies. So our bodies share many common attributes as the given bodies of Homo sapiens, but how we engage in sex and take part in reproduction is not one of them. So it's this sexual distinctiveness is that which makes us male and female. Should I repeat that? It feels like we're a bit confused about that right now. So this dissimilarity in our bodies gives rise, and this is really the key here, to a sexual asymmetry, the phrase evolutionary psychologists use to describe the fundamental reality that the potential consequences of sexual intercourse are far more immediate and serious for women than they are for men. So what I'm saying is that there's a dramatic inequality when it comes to sex. Isn't that right? Women and men engage in the same act, but it is women who get pregnant and not men. So this sexual asymmetry ought to ennoble women, and in many cultures, both historically and today, it certainly does. But it also underlies the natural vulnerability that women and their children experience, a vulnerability that callous men have exploited throughout human history. This, of course, is what feminists rightly respond to. And let's be really clear about it. This basic fact of life, that women get pregnant and men don't, is that which underlies all strains of feminism, though I think that's largely been overlooked these days. Sexual asymmetry is truly feminism's raison d'etre, and why I, too, am so interested in feminist theory. As my favorite hard-left feminist, Camille Paglia, put it, it's not male society, but Mother Nature who lays the heaviest burden on women. So then the question for a society that really cares about treating both women and men with justice and equal dignity and supporting and encouraging the good use of all their talents then becomes, how do we respond personally and culturally to the reality of sexual asymmetry, the ever-apparent sexual and reproductive differences of the male and female bodies that are not going away? Well, the feminist response since the 1960s was to advocate for the widespread use of contraception and abortion, or legalization of abortion, maybe now widespread use. Through contraception and abortion, these feminists sought to change this asymmetrical equation. They thought if you separate sex from its consequences, if you separate sex from baby making, then women, like men, will be able to enjoy sex without all the trouble that naturally may flow from it. Men's bodies, after all, do not carry the consequences of their fertility within them. Contraception and abortion afforded women a means to imitate men's ability to have pleasurable sex without consequences, to have sex and just walk away. Sexual asymmetry and the feminine vulnerability that accompanies it would be cured, it was thought, by decoupling sex from procreation, relieving women of the consequences of sex, and thus equalizing the sexual experiences of men and women. But whereas men are sexually and reproductively detached by nature, women must act affirmatively, and in the case of abortion, destructively, if they are to imitate male sexual and reproductive autonomy. And it goes without saying that the pill does not protect the heart. Now, by advocating contraception and abortion as the cure, second-wave feminists put the onus on women and women's bodies, when authentic reproductive justice and sexual equality would require, it seems to me, and more about this in a minute, that men and society at large respect, protect, and support women's unique childbearing capacity alongside all their other abilities and talents. This is, of course, why the 19th century suffragists, the early American feminists who fought for the right to vote, viewed abortion as an attack on women as women. And many of the same remained skeptical or rejected newly minted contraceptive methods, calling instead for what? For chastity on the part of men. Votes for women, chastity for men was actually a suffragist slogan coined by Chris Paul Pankhurst. Google didn't have a good image, though, of we don't have the chastity for men on there. Did happen, you can find it. Attempting to imitate male sexual and reproductive detachment, a sort of free love, male-oriented sexual ethic did not seem particularly pro-women to these feminists. Not to mention if they'd lived to see the day of injecting women for decades with hormones that make them lose their libido and become depressed. But that's for another talk. As Sidney Callahan has put it, and I think this is just right, the modern feminist movement, she refers to as the second wave feminist movement, made a mistaken move at a critical juncture rightly rebelling against unequal education, restricted work opportunities, and women's downtrodden political status, these feminists also rejected the 19th century feminine, I would call pro-woman, sexual ethic. And I don't have time to get into that now, but they called it voluntary motherhood, and it wasn't contraception, it wasn't abortion, and I'm happy to talk about it during the Q&A if you'd like, because I think it has some consequences for us. But this is not all. Second wave feminist advocates of contraception and abortion not only sought the cure in women's bodies rather than in men's character and society's benevolence, in attempting to decouple sex from procreation as a means to equalize women's sexual experiences to those of men, these feminists ended up exacerbating that very sexual asymmetry, that very vulnerability they hoped to relieve. More than 50 years after the pill, more than 40 years after Roe versus Wade, nearly half of all pregnancies each year are still unintended. There are more than 1 million abortions a year, half of which the Guttmacher Institute tells us are due to failed or misused contraception. Thus, even after all this time, even after all these attempts to suppress or reject these embodied realities, they persist. Sex still makes babies, and women are still the ones whose bodies bear them. So contraception and abortion haven't equalized the sexual experiences of men and women. They haven't relieved women of the consequences of sex or the vulnerabilities of pregnancy. What they have done is detach men even further from the procreative potential of sexual intercourse, offering men the illusion that sex can finally be completely and utterly and totally consequence-free. That's the hookup culture, right? And what's further freed men has further encumbered and burdened many, many women. And this is especially true among the poor. For since the advent of the pill in 1960 and the culture of sexual risk-taking and ascendancy of the male-oriented hookup culture that followed, we've seen a dramatic increase in single motherhood. As many of you probably know, 40% of children now born to unwed mothers, which is the leading indicator of poverty in the United States. So for a review of the economics of all this, you can go see that great Austin Institute 7-minute clip, The Economics of Sex. You could read the really long George Akerlof 1996 piece, or you can read the sort of middle piece that I wrote in Christian Bioethics, which is an Oxford University press or journal, which is on my website, erika.bachiochi.com. And I usually spend a lot more time on this, but I'm now going to switch gears here. So there's plenty of evidence in our culture's current response to sexual asymmetry has not benefited women overall. Even if we could say that it has benefited that small sliver of elite career-minded women who want to have uncommitted sex and not have children. So here's that Hannah Rosen quote that Donna and I were talking about at lunch from The End of Men, when she sort of extols the hookup culture for high-powered women. And then belies the claim and the story she tells about these women, but you can read that for yourself. For women who hope to have and raise a family, which is the great majority of women, though I understand it is shrinking, whether they be privileged and educated, or poor with less education, homemakers or more professionally inclined, the feminist quest to imitate male reproductive detachment from childbearing works very much to women's disadvantage. Okay, so what's the better response? So that's the question I now want to turn to as we sort of shift lenses here. So it seems to me that our culture must acknowledge sexual difference, or more properly, sexual asymmetry, and the vulnerability inherent in childbearing and in caregiving, if it's going to authentically promote women's equality. Instead of valorizing autonomy as the be-all and end-all, as we heard some before, we need to be encouraging a culture-wide ethic of care. So I'm not going to get into kind of the high-level policy questions about maternity leave and all of that. We can talk about that in the Q&A if you want, because I think there's an often missing piece to that discussion: men and their shared responsibility for the vulnerable. So I now want to argue that women need men, children need men, we all need men to answer the great vocation that is fatherhood. And in case it's not yet obvious, the fallout of the sexual revolution has been particularly hard on fatherhood, especially among the most disadvantaged populations. So now let me turn directly to the subjects of vulnerability and caregiving and mothers and fathers. So I want to leaning on a favorite feminist philosopher, as a helpful interlocutor, I now want to map out what I think our bodies teach us about vulnerability and how this points to the collaborative work of men and women in the family and in the home, in the world. Now, for most feminists, especially the most vocal, acknowledging women's vulnerability is like playing right into the hands of the patriarchy. It's like suggesting that women ought to be barefoot and pregnant and relegated to the kitchen. But there is a strain of feminists, call them care or relational or dependency feminists, for whom human vulnerability is simply reality, and a reality most worthy of our attention and deliberate response. Care feminists see more clearly that vulnerability and dependency are inescapable facts of, as embodied human beings. We are all inevitably vulnerable and dependent, or are caring for the vulnerable and dependent much of our lives. Human dependency then is not some exception to be accommodated alongside the normal quest for autonomy. Human dependency is part of the ordinary pattern of human life. Authentic human dignity and moral worth then adheres not in our autonomy, a la Immanuel Kant, but in the human person being a bodily being, as Alistair MacIntyre would say, explicitly acknowledging in the first few pages of his reliance on care feminists for his insights in this book, a dependent, rational animal. And so this is really the trouble, right? The reason why the feminist quest for equality as autonomy, most manifest in the relentless pursuit of abortion rights, really eats away at itself. The autonomous individual who plays the starring role in the modern political project ignores the dependency common to every person, and so it also denigrates those who devote themselves to the care of others, most especially women. And so it's no surprise that care feminists should be concerned with autonomy taking center stage in feminist theory, even if this concern of theirs seems to undercut philosophically their own sort of a priori support for abortion rights. So Eva Feder-Kittay, one of the leading care feminist philosophers, the one who Alistair MacIntyre talks about in his book, brought attention some 20 years ago to the need to be more culturally attentive to the reality of dependency, and importantly, to the value and needs of those caring for dependents. She makes a robust case against what I've been calling autonomy feminism in her book, Love's Labor. There she writes, whether or not it is desirable to be a relational giving self, my argument rests on the moral requirement of dependency work that makes such a self indispensable. She goes on, it is neither capricious, nor misogynist, nor disrespectful of individual rights when we insist that individuals who mother infants or young children defer their own desires and even needs to meet those of their dependent child. Now, Kittay knows that women throughout all time and in all human societies, including our own, are far more likely to be the primary caregivers of children and other dependents. But most feminists, including Kittay, say this is due to social construction. This is how the powers that be, the men, have wanted it, and so this is how it is and continues to be. And so while they work to culturally elevate caregiving, care feminists like Kittay also seek to de-gender caregiving, arguing that it is so critical to a humane society that men ought to undertake it as well. So to promote this tendency, Kittay uses the term mother to denote any proper caregiver, regardless of the person's sex. Men, too, can be mothers, she says quite explicitly. So the initial problem with this formulation, I'm sure you all can think of many, but is that recent findings contradict the claim that caregiving by women is born of social construction alone. In the United States, where women have achieved marked political and social equality, studies continue to show that most mothers would prefer part-time to full-time work. And in countries such as Norway, where generous social benefits encourage both mothers and fathers to care for young children, mothers' time at home still predominates. When given the choice, women choose to give care at rates higher than men do. The theory of social construction ultimately can't make sense of all this because it neglects human embodiedness. Ironic for a philosopher like Kittay, who otherwise does justice to our animal nature. Indeed, Kittay's argument for the fundamental value of the mother, that archetypal caregiver in the life of society, as she herself says, would be strengthened not by ceding motherhood to an androgynous disposition of attentive service, but by explicitly affirming that maternal experience that first defines the term mother, pregnancy and childbearing. After all, the human being at its most vulnerable enters the world through his own mother, his body within her body. Indeed, her body also naturally provides complete nourishment for his body when he emerges from her womb and for several months thereafter. Mothers, by definition, are the custodians of vulnerable human life. Indeed, because the unborn human being is dependent upon his mother in an exclusive way, such that only she can meet the unborn child's needs, Kitte's own reasoning suggests that mothers have an affirmative duty of care to nurture the unborn child, never to destroy it. Efforts to de-gender mothering devalue this essential maternal enterprise, which is enjoyed by women alone. So I will very soon get to the affirmative duties of fathers, but let's first rest on this sort of essential truth. No other caregiving in the common course of human experience better manifests the reality of human dependency and the proper human response. This is why abortion is such a betrayal of women and the unique place of mothers in an ethic of care. It's a shame that Kitte herself can't see that yet. But in bearing new life and in sacrificing some of their autonomy to care for that life, mothers too become vulnerable. And so here is the next poignant Kitte insight. The caregiver's caregiving status, her nurturing and duty to love her dependents selflessly, have now made her vulnerable and dependent, not to the full extent of the dependent, but to such an extent that she needs the help of another, one who can provide for her needs while she selflessly cares for the dependent's need. Kitte contends that the caregiver needs a provider, by which she means, in the final analysis, a generous welfare state. In Kitte and others' care feminist writing, you could say we're given a strong sense of what they call the vertical relationship between mother and child, or more broadly, caregiver and dependent. Don't worry, I'm going to get back to that. And the philosophical case these feminists have made in support of caregiving is really crucial for helping us shore up cultural support for this essential work, its importance and the need for society to acknowledge, value, and promote it. This is a place of real common ground. But Kitte and other care feminists do not see a differentiated role for fathers. On their view, if men are going to be of help, which they think they ought to be, then they should step in and take over a piece of the caregiving work traditionally performed by women. Again, men can be mothers. This frees women up to participate in the workplace, enabling women to become financially independent of men, who in the feminist view would otherwise dominate them. It would also allow men to experience the merits of caregiving for themselves and for their children. In this view, men and women can and should alternate caregiver and provider roles quite readily. So many feminists, including Princeton's own Anne-Marie Slaughter, have increasingly argued that to achieve real sexual equality, the women's movement now needs a men's movement to draw men out of the world of work and to take part in the caregiving of the home. Slaughter and others argue that the feminist revolution has stalled, that has failed to achieve absolute parity in the workplace after making great gains in the 1980s and the 90s, because women continue to choose the needs of their families over their professional advancement. If society better valued caregiving, she reasons, then perhaps men would do more of it, and we'd see greater equity in both the home and in the workplace. So I am deeply sympathetic to this new feminist tendency, mostly because I'm happy that high-powered women like Slaughter have finally come to see the value of caregiving. I'm going to put a couple quotes from the book up on the screen. She actually says before she had the experience she did, if any of you read about it in Atlantic Monthly, or having to come home to be a tenured professor at Princeton to care for her children along with her husband, that she really devalued at-home mothers, and this whole experience helped her to sort of value them. So this in itself was a great thing that a woman like Slaughter is sort of seeing the value of that kind of care. Feminists like Kitte and Slaughter have been trying to soften the anti-motherhood, anti-family edge that Elizabeth Fox Genovese and others so eloquently exposed decades ago. It's even part of Hillary Clinton's recasting. Her Facebook and Twitter bios identifies her first as wife, mom, and grandma, and then only as lawyer, Secretary of State, presidential candidate. In this way, Genovese's critique was a grand success. However, very few of these feminists have noticed that their ardent advocacy for abortion rights and androgynous parenting actually stands in dramatic tension with their newfound appreciation for caregivers, caregiving, and the great good of the family in the lives of men, women, and children. After all, were it not for the wedding of the sexual revolution with the women's movement, many more men would, I think, value children and caregiving as night follows day. I know this how? In part because the men I know who aren't beholden to the fleeting attractions of the sexual revolution do value children and their nurture and education as the most essential work, indeed as their most essential work. I dare say that at least the Christian men I know are the very picture of the emotionally available, responsible, and involved fathers that my feminist sisters and I once dreamed of. How else do you think it would be possible for me to be here with all of you, being the mother of 6 children? One's missing, the really cute 5-year-old. He's not in that picture. But let's also not discount too quickly the great men who, well before the women's movement, and still today, sacrifice time with their families to earn a living for their families. So the essential goods of nurture and caregiving, so often managed primarily and often quite happily by women, would be protected and preserved. So I just want to say this on Princeton's campus. Ms. Slaughter, there's a whole category of men who already deeply extol, support, and share in caregiving. These men are, by nature of their affection and respect for the women and children in their lives, are way ahead of you in this men's movement. I'm happy to make an introduction, if you like. But there's more. It's deeply inadequate to define a child's parents simply by their tasks as caregivers and providers. Mothers and fathers are these, of course, and today we do see a multiplicity of arrangements as women and men take part in the public and private spheres of life. And I do think this is a good, which we can talk about in the Q&A if you'd like. But these looser social roles in society and in the family do not justify our forgetfulness of the unique contributions men as men make in the lives of their own children, and just as importantly, in the lives of their children's mothers. So reclaiming fatherhood and the collaboration of men and women in the lives of their children and beyond is truly, in my view, the single best response to sexual asymmetry. And so here's where I disagree with the care feminists, and the disagreement really is perhaps as crucial as the agreement. For these feminists, fathers can and should stand in for the mother in that vertical relationship of mother to child, but the father's manness does not make any unique contribution in this view to the healthy upbringing of the child. So to understand why, let's go back to the body. So I'm going to take another sip of coffee before I'm leaving you all hanging. What would she be talking about? So when we start with the body, and so with vulnerability and dependency, we come, I think, upon an interesting sequence. The quintessential vulnerable person is the child. I think care feminists are right to say that the mother stands in immediate vertical relation as custodian of the vulnerable child. In the first place, when the child's body is in the mother's own body. Now, the father qua father stands not in relation to the child with this sort of maternal immediacy, but he does stand in immediate relation, say, horizontally to the mother. The father is known through the mother because the child is the fruit of their sexual relationship. The father, just in terms of mere biology here, stands at a relative distance from the unborn and nursing child. This is, of course, the reproductive detachment or autonomy of the male body. I talked about earlier, that which modern-day autonomy feminists have sought to imitate. So at first glance, the body seems to tell us that the man can at some level remain autonomous. He can be financial provider or stand-in mother, should he so choose, or he can donate his sperm and go play video games, as far as anyone is concerned. Beyond his biological contribution, the father qua father is not all that necessary. But human experience aggregated in sociological data indicates the first impression the body gives is quite wrong. The data on fathers' relationships with their children and their children's mother illumines the father's distinctive, if forgotten, contribution, a contribution that is subtly revealed by the body when we look a bit more closely. So I'm just going to throw up on the screen the effect of the father's absence on children, which I'm sure other people have talked about before, because I want to get directly to the father's distinctive contribution. It's a really important question, and I hope that out there others will be adding to the research. But I want to look quickly at some of Brad Wilcox's work, which is always enlightening, and of course he, I'm sure, is a hero of Joseph Price, of mine, of many people at Love and Fidelity. So Wilcox says that one of the most important influences a father can have on his children is indirect. Fathers influence their children in large part through the quality of their relationship with the mother of the child. A father in a good relationship with the mother of his children is more likely to have children who are healthier, both psychologically and emotionally. We see this play out most devastatingly in the cases of divorce, which usually affect fathers' investment in their children far more than mothers. And so divorce frequently results in a deterioration of the father-child relationship, certainly true in my own life. And I think we can actually see this truth played out in the lessons of the body. While mothers have this immediate relationship with the vulnerable child through gestation, birth, and breastfeeding, the father's relationship with his child seems to be sort of secondary, we might say, to the primary mating relationship with the mother of his children. And this is also echoed by evolutionary biology investment theories that say that males tend to focus more attention on mating, while females more on parenting. And so echoing Brad, I want to say that the body helps us get a glimpse of the father's first distinctive contribution to his children's well-being is that he focused as a matter of priority on ensuring a strong and healthy relationship with his children's mothers. Go out on dates. And as it turns out, the single most important determinant of a mother's happiness is the very same: the father's commitment and emotional investment in the woman's well-being and that of their children. So greater governmental assistance and high-quality daycare, no matter how legitimate or generous, and we could debate that for hours, I'm sure, cannot provide mothers with the emotional supports they need to mother their children and flourish while doing so. But a father is, of course, not only a support for the mother. The father's attentive presence to the children in and of itself is also necessary. So children whose fathers are an attentive, caring presence in their lives have better educational outcomes overall, show more emotional security, confidence exploring the world, ability to deal with school stresses, and better social connections with peers. Researchers point to the father's propensity to engage his infants and preschoolers in stimulating rough and tumble play as the reason for the children's superior ability to regulate their feelings and behavior. Boys with their own fathers in their home, as many of you I'm sure know, show better impulse control. And fathers more than mothers tend to encourage children to do things for themselves at a young age with an eye toward ensuring their competence and confidence in the world later in life. So if the mother's initial physical immediacy to the child provides important kind of custodial care for the child's emotional and physical needs, I think that the father's relative distance from the infant child in itself plays an important role too. The father's special attention and affection that he gives to his child gives the confidence he needs to separate from the mother's abode and push his own limits in that essential human maturation process toward independence. The mother's custodial care and the father's nudges toward independence are both necessary to the child's development. Though these maternal and paternal tendencies may become less explicit as the child grows, in those early months and perhaps even years, when the child's development is so critical, I think these embodied realities tend to prevail. So when we admit the primacy of embodied dependency, we see the mother's custodial duties quite readily. Her body tells her a great deal about her obligations to her dependent child. We we have a harder time discerning the place of the father. His body speaks less directly. Without a culture that expects him to fulfill his paternal duties and that expresses moral opprobrium when he neglects to do so, a father may lack direction, uncertain about his essential role in the lives of his children. It is a chivalrous culture, a culture that believes in the moral duty to care for the vulnerable. It demands that fathers stay, that the father be. And so is right that woman has a civilizing effect on man, but it isn't because of woman's natural virtue. She can be vicious too. It's due to sexual asymmetry. The vulnerability and dependency women experience in their very bodies and in caregiving cast moral duties upon men to give of themselves in service of their wives and dependent children. This relationship is an alliance of trust and collaboration, not dependency for the woman, and autonomy for the man. Truly loving the other helps each one to turn away from the isolated, rights-asserting self and toward the relational duties owed to the other. This is, I think, the more authentic path of sexual equality within sexual difference, less about static roles and traits, and more about a respectful regard for the beloved's gifts and talents, a courageous affirmation of the corresponding duties that arise out of sexual asymmetry, and an active discernment of how each is called to love and serve the common good amidst his or her particular circumstances in the enterprises of the family and of society. And this sure needs a lifetime commitment. Historically, from Aristotle forward, we have attempted to understand woman in relation to man. Man and his reproductive detachment as primary, woman and her relative vulnerability as secondary, in relation to and sometimes lesser than. But when we take the body seriously and so take human vulnerability, dependency, and caregiving seriously, which I think we must, that is, when we conceptually prioritize human vulnerability over autonomy, the man now stands in relation to the woman, and with relative distance but deep and authentic connection in relation to his own child. The woman is that place of abode, so to speak, where all the action, the sacred, wondrous, life-giving action is. Men find a noble reason for their body's power in service of the vulnerable and those who care for them. So a genuine culture of care then demands that men turn their penchant for conquest, a masculine tendency that when undisciplined gives way to gangs, gamers, predators, should I keep listing them? Inward to conquer their passions for the good of the vulnerable. In Asian cultures where men greatly outnumber women, some worry that male aggression will threaten civilized culture. But testosterone levels drop when men become fathers, and drop even further when they are attentive fathers. The self-possession fatherhood vitiates against external acts of aggression, so long as the man both recognizes and is supported in his vocation to master himself for the good of his wife and children. So it's no wonder that men have been historically responsible for building up civilizations in which the family can thrive. Men of virtue, men who have battled with their own members, so to speak, know the threat that vicious men pose to the vulnerable and to society. Thus, men of virtue are usually the ones at the very forefront of every effort to protect the innocent and vulnerable, especially the innocent and vulnerable in their own lives. So, men and women working together, knowing both the constraints and possibilities of vulnerable human embodiedness and the sexual asymmetries that persist, can envision anew the structures and institutions that allow for the proper care and formation of the vulnerable person, marriage and family being the first and most obvious. But we are learning more daily about the merits of women and men collaborating on teams at all levels of the public sphere as well. Women tend to give priority to the care of the person and the health of relationships. Men tend to give priority to adherence to principle and institutional integrity. Though we all know that exceptions abound and the really great individuals can kind of balance both. The idea is to take delight in the differences when they emerge, never to pigeonhole individuals into meeting a preordained way of being. Just as in the family, authentic collaboration allows each to learn from the other, curbing insular qualities of a single perspective, giving way to full, free, and flourishing human beings and human relationships. So let me conclude by saying this. In the quest to get women out of the home, second wave feminism called upon women to imitate the reproductive and sexual autonomy of men's bodies, and in so doing sought to push women away from the care of the person. By contrast, an authentic feminist ethic, an ethic of care, calls upon men to acknowledge the gift of women's bodies and to join women as partners in prioritizing the vulnerable and dependent person, first in our own families, but then also in politics, business, economics, and law. This is, I think, the authentic collaboration of men and women that is so needed today. Thank you. Okay.
If I was a second wave feminist, I'd want her to stay home all the time. So thank goodness she's on our side. Erika is here, and her 6 children are at home with her wonderful husband.
I'm putting it up on the screen so you
There
all
they
see.
are. And so we need to give him a hand as well for being there. Thank you, Dad. But I was also remiss in failing to thank the Wheatley Institution for sponsoring this talk. That's great work to provide financial support to allow Erika and others to take some time away to be with us, to take time away from one kind of caregiving for this other kind of caregiving. So thank you to the Wheatley Institution. Let's give them a hand as well. And we have about 10 minutes for Q&A, so we'll get to it. Please wait for the microphone.
Stumped. Oh, yeah, hi. So just when I would go to different schools and talk about abortion, afterwards, there'd be a couple questions and we'd sort of, abortion's so easy, right? They're just kind of like answered pretty quickly, and then someone would say, but what about same-sex marriage? It would be a talk about abortion, and then the question about, that was before Obergefell. Hi.
This is a bit annoying, but I just want to thank you for that presentation. I felt like leaping up a few times and saying, amen, and
That
just,
would have been welcome,
yeah.
by the way. It's kind of like.
But really brilliant, and thank you.
Sure. You can, if you want to pick them. I'm drinking my coffee.
Hi, my name is Esther. I'm a student at the University of Pennsylvania, and I was wondering if you're aware of any research that spoke to the effects of mothers who reject this caregiver role and they believe their character aligns more with what you define as this paternal detachment, and what are the effects on the family or on the marriage?
I think there's lots of data. I don't know that we can, there's lots of correlation everywhere, right? Since the divorce and all sorts of things. I don't know if you can see some sort of direct line. There is data on women working and how that affects children. The stuff I've seen, I've not dug deeply into this because I don't know that that's really the problem. It could be a problem, obviously, but I don't know that that's really the problem. So I haven't spent a lot of time looking at this. The data I saw said there's not really an impact. One of the things that you have to see too is a lot of the data looks at educational outcomes. And so if you have more money that's going into a marriage based on 2 incomes, and so the child can go have violin lessons and soccer clubs and all sorts of that, then you might be able to see more in educational outcomes. Are you taking that child all the way until their own, what are they doing in college in terms of relationships? How is their marriage? Those kinds of things. How do they feel? And what are the kind of duties they take up for caregiving? We don't see that yet. So Yeah, I mean, do you want to?
Right. So I got really excited when you quickly made the joke about the welfare state, actually. So I need to ask you, do you think that the welfare state and such institutions such as child support have been an intentional slight against fatherhood? That is to say that the state is trying to replace fathers.
You don't
and
mean
make,
child support, though. Do you mean child support?
Yeah, I meant
Okay,
child
so child
support.
support would be coming out of the father's pocket, right?
Yes.
Okay. So when a father abandons a family, he should definitely be paying child support.
Okay.
Yeah, so on that, yes. And child support should be more rigorous and should hunt down fathers, and their wages should be held by the state to give mothers support for children.
Okay.
So on the state, and actually, let me just add to that is not a deterrent. In fact, that is, if a man knows like he's going to be in it for, the money anyway, I mean, what we do see, and this is feminist research, so this is stuff I've read in feminist law reviews of them citing, it's not feminist research, hopefully it's just sociological research, but feminist citing, showing that men who realize that they have a serious obligation to a child who is born are actually more precautious in their sexual behavior. So when you connect children, so in college campuses, I keep wanting to like bring kids onto campus. Like, do you see this is kids, sex? Do you see how these things go together? So I'm still working on how to do that, and I have a lot of children I could probably bring over. So no, but I do actually have some ideas. So if anyone wants to talk to me about that. But anyway, but I think if you have a better connection between sex and dependence, right, dependency, then men are less likely to, have irresponsible sex, basically. And I think women would be too, right? But men don't feel the burn about abortion like women do, right? Women don't feel the burn about the pill and about other forms of contraception that women are always taking. So when men are just sort of left, anyway, so in terms of the state, so the state, much more difficult question, right? I think there's, and this isn't really, I mean, I'm more of a theorist, less of a kind of a policy wonk, though I work at a policy wonkish kind of place. Although, ethics is probably pretty good on theory too. So I would turn you to the Reformicons and just say, go and read their stuff in terms of finding or read Ross Douthat's Grand New Party on pro-family policy that is not libertarian in the sense that it says we cut out the government entirely because it provides disincentives for marriage. I mean, right now we are in sort of a mess and we have to recover. And so we do have to be helping women who are having multiple children with multiple, men. We need to help provide for them. We have to as a community. We also need to be building up a marriage culture. We have to be doing both. And so, how does the state work into that? I would just say go and read, who remembers the name of the Reformicons book? Room to Grow. Room to Grow, you can find it online, it's all online. So one of the ideas that I think is most important, which is why I wish that in a week we were electing a Florida senator, is that he actually was taking a lot of this really seriously. One of the main things he wanted to do was to buff up the child tax credit, just as Rick Santorum had before. Hillary has actually added to her platform since Trump came out with his child care thing, which allowed for money to go to stay-at-home parents. Hillary actually said, we should buff up the child tax credit. So, I mean, that's good that people are thinking about, because it's got to be an American way of doing this, which has to be a place where there's choice involved, right? So families, if you just say, let's subsidize daycare more and more and more, and more, well, that's putting, right, the thumb of the state very strongly on one choice that a family makes. But lots of families want parents and usually mothers to be home, and so we need to be allowing an American pro-choice way for parents to make those choices, and so allowing them to keep their own tax money to decide what they're going to do with it is important, I think. Yes.
So my name is Daniel Greenidge. I'm a student here at Princeton. I had a question about women in the workplace, because I do a lot of science. I know many women who are outstanding scientists. And I hear two things from them a lot. The first is that because they're women, they're not able to advance as far as they'd like. So there's sort of a ceiling in their careers. No one takes them seriously. The grants don't get funded, these problems. But they also feel like their professional obligations harm their ability to be caregivers in the home. Because they're going for tenure at the exact same time when they're trying to
Right.
raise kids, and there's this pressure to publish or perish.
Yep.
So kind of like as a guy who wants to do science and who will be in the professional world,
Yeah.
What should I do to
Yeah.
make things easier for women
Yeah.
to care at home? I mean, I guess this can
Yeah.
apply to beyond science.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of the next frontier. I mean, and I think we really need to do this in a way that sort of let me step back, in a way that, so people like Anne-Marie Slaughter are thinking about this, right? And that's good. People like Eva Fetcher-Titt are thinking about this. But one, woman who's actually noticed that, where there's a bit of a contradiction because of such a pro-abortion kind of mentality in our culture. I'm going to get to your question, I swear. Is Robin West at Georgetown. Anybody from Georgetown? So she's actually acknowledged that, maybe there's this contradiction between sort of the pro-choice position and helping women in the workplace. And so she actually wrote a book called Common Ground on sort of bringing together pro-life and she actually said, let's take pro-life women seriously. Like, let's look at what they have to say. So I'm really happy about that. I say all that because I think we can't, the way the left is thinking about this without taking seriously, the fact that that employers can say, well, just get an abortion. I mean, it's going to be in the way of your, so just get an abortion. So, I mean, if we don't take that seriously, that there are dependents, they're human beings, it's our first responsibility as a civilization, to take care, to make sure that they have life, then we're not going to really, I don't think, get anywhere. And I think conservatives would be a lot more sort of amenable to thinking through these questions if we had far more restrictions on abortion, if we had far more support for life. And you see this in Western Europe. Marion Glennon's done a lot of work on this, or did in the 90s, Harvard law professor, on just looking at how the more, the state being able to help more, or the community being able to help more, and then much more moderate abortion policies. And a lot of the state saying, we want to support mothers and caregiving and children very, strongly, but then having more of a balance. We have just, this sort of, the only women who really are as successful as men in our professionally are the ones who basically don't have children, right? Because we don't have any sort of policies that support caregiving. So my thought of this is that it's a bit more of a problem with work. I mean, it's a big debate. It's the beginning of the debate. I'm thinking a lot about this. I hope all of you will be out thinking a lot about this. But the problem with work is that we all sort of think of, Joan Williams out at UC Hastings talks, I think that's the school, she talks about the unencumbered worker. So we all of sort of late capitalist kind of thinking about work is all this unencumbered worker. So if you have a man who has a big family or just wants to spend time with his family, that's going to be hard for him too if you have these sort of hours that are so oppressive. In science, I think that there's a sort of type of specialization that requires a lot. I mean, in all areas, but I think especially in science, there's a certain specialization in medicine, certain specialization that does require kind of grueling kinds of hours that it wouldn't be as required of other areas where there can be more sharing, right, of sort of intelligence and that type of thing. So on the question of discrimination, I'm sort of shocked by that, only in the sense that I feel like our leading universities are really trying to plow ahead with women in STEM. Really trying to say, we want you in STEM, So that's surprising to me that they would feel like there's any sort of discrimination holding them back. That would be shocking to me. I'm not saying there isn't, and please don't all come barreling down and tell me about all the discrimination. I'm sure that, but it would be surprising because of the desire to have women more representative for all the gifts that women bring to anything that they do. But then in terms of what do we do about it? And again, I think this is a hard question. I think it would be beneficial to both women and men to just have more from the universities, who should be probably doing it first, to the government, to everywhere else, private employers like Yahoo and Google and all these guys with all this money, to try to say, how can we make more family-friendly environments at workplaces? I think that's good for our society. We're obsessed with work. And if we're ever going to replace the sort of autonomous individual who success in the workplace is the only thing that matters, with sort of an understanding of we are all relational, dependent, we have obligations to others, if we're ever going to replace that, we have to look at our sort of work ethic, right? I mean, just how it is domineering in our culture. And importantly, and I think this is a great place for people to go in terms of research, that the time spent caring for others, whether it be children, whether it be the work people do in caregiving professions, whether it be elderly, parents, wherever it is, it creates virtues in the person that are so needed culturally, right? Are needed by economists, are needed by politicians, to be thinking of the person and the duties owed to people. Because we don't think enough about that, right? Duties owed to others. So all of that means like it would behoove companies and all sorts of people to be thinking about what are the virtues that a woman who has spent so much time, I mean, especially, sorry, but with a big family, I mean, come on, like juggling and doing, and like being strict with one child and turning and being, merciful with another. And I mean, all the things that have been done. I mean, there's great kind of commercials and ads talking about all the different things that mothers do or caregivers do. I mean, it's shocking, like the virtue and Carrie Gress has written a book about this, but that develops through the care of another human being. And it's virtues that we need desperately in our culture right now. Yeah, over there.
Hi, I'm Kevin Agostinelli. I'm a student here at Princeton University, and I just want to bring a light that an issue on campus that we recently had regarding the Princeton Women's Center, and there was some scrutiny revolving around the Women's Center recently by the student editorial board based on the idea that the Women's Center is focusing only on issues that appeal more to the left and issues that deal with more of the leftist ideology, that it's not actually a bipartisan women's center. And as a group that is actually endowed by the university, it should respect both the views of conservative women and liberal women. And just in short, that view has received a lot of backlash. It was an editorial board post, mainly on the idea that the conservative women movement is more a movement that is really promoted by men, especially conservative men, and that it's not actually a legitimate movement, and that not many men actually truly believe this. And a lot of the ideas spread around were that, true women and women who really believe in women's rights can never actually register and promote that idea. And that is why the Women's Center tends to focus on these issues, because these are the
Those
issues
are real
that
women.
women
So
truly care about.
I am not a real woman standing before you.
So, I mean,
Yeah. So I would invite you to have on campus these other women. So Mona Sharon, Catherine Bacalek, me, who are all, I mean, there's lots of these women floating around who have other ideas. I think that's a great point that people brought up. I applaud those who did. And I would just say, to the men who are arguing things like this, give your sisters a platform. Do you know what I mean? Like, just step back and let the women make the arguments for a while, And it doesn't mean give them the arguments. They know the arguments, believe me. But it just means, like, take a step back, go fishing. Just kidding. Go do their laundry, and give them a platform. Anyone else, I'll be around. Thank you.